What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at Avaya is what the world needs.
Hello, Avaya family. I'm Andy Anderson. My partner Ike Allen and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of Avaya University. Avaya is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive resources. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Our fellow teacher, Dr. Zoe Shaw, is with us today to talk about setting healthy boundaries. Dr. Zoe is a licensed psychotherapist, author, speaker, podcast host, relationship coach, and fitness fanatic. She is also a mom to 5, a wife, and is passionate about helping women who struggle in difficult relationships, especially sometimes difficult relationships with themselves. Welcome to Avaya, Dr. Zoe.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Andy. I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, so excited to have you. And I would love a little background first. How did you get into what you do today?
Yeah, so, I'm a licensed psychotherapist, so I did the whole grad school doctorate thing and started my early practice actually working in the adoption triad because I have a history with adoption. And as I've been working for over 20 years, which is crazy, but it's the reality. I've been doing this for over 20 years. And over time, I've really fallen in love with working with women in difficult relationships. So I've niched down. I also work with couples, but it's just kind of my sweet spot. I've had my own history of being in a difficult relationship. And so it's the work that I've come to do. I used to work predominantly in a private practice, classical setting, and now I do most of my work virtually, and I do a lot of writing and speaking, and it's amazing to do what I love.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate the background on you. And let's talk boundaries, right? We're talking about how to set healthy boundaries today. So how do you define boundaries?
So I think of boundaries as self-care. I think of them as lines that we draw in the sand for ourselves. And notice I never mentioned anybody else, because a lot of times people think about boundaries as rules we set for other people. But no, boundaries are things that you decide for yourself. They are lines that you draw.
And what are some examples of a boundary we set for ourselves?
No, that's a good question. So a boundary we set for ourselves, sometimes when I'm working with women in relationships, we talk about, or looking to get into relationships, we talk about red flags, we talk about yellow flags. And those sometimes setting up these ideas for ourselves about what we will and will not tolerate in relationships. Those are your boundaries. They should be very specific for you, because a boundary for one person is not a boundary for someone else. So for someone, it may not be okay for them. I'm using an example from a client. If, a guy decides that he's going to ask her to go on a date for tomorrow. For her, that's a boundary. For her, she might feel that's disrespectful. And so she chooses, if he asks me what she might consider last minute, I'm not going to go because that's important to me. For somebody else, that might not be a boundary. But once again, a boundary is something that you decide for yourself.
And in that example, is that a boundary that you communicate with someone, that other person, so they know right why? I guess you said no to going out to dinner last minute.
I think if we want to be in relationship with people, we have to communicate our boundaries. Sometimes when we don't care if we're going to be in relationship with people, it's not necessary for us to communicate our boundaries. We don't need to communicate our boundaries to the person in front of us or behind us in line who did something that we're not okay with. I think because sometimes people assume that a boundary is a rule we give to somebody else, they feel like they need to tell everybody what their boundaries are. We only need to communicate our boundaries to people that we want to be in relationship with.
I think that's such a good point, and especially in our world today, right? I definitely think that the boundaries are being communicated maybe too much in scenarios that maybe aren't like necessary. So that's a good point.
Right. I mean, I've had people say, "Oh, you just crossed my boundary." And I'm thinking, well, I don't really know you, and you didn't communicate anything to me. So that just wasn't necessary. But that's something she should have resonated, right, with herself and said, "Oh, that doesn't feel okay. This person just crossed my boundary, so I'm going to remove myself."
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Got it. And so when we're talking about difficult relationships, toxic relationships, how is the applications of boundaries different in a toxic relationship versus a healthy relationship?
Well, it gets really complicated for a number of reasons, because when you're in a toxic relationship, there is often, not always, but to some extent, some codependency there, right? And so it gets a little complicated because it's harder when you are in a codependent relationship. Obviously, that's when we really need to focus on applying the boundaries. But what we know, especially about toxic people, is that their jam is not respecting boundaries. And so what you cannot do is expect them to respect your boundaries. You have to know that when you set a boundary with someone who's toxic, what they will do is get worse. And plenty of people tell me, oh, I tried setting boundaries and it didn't work. They didn't respect them. And once again, I go back to the concept that, number one, boundaries are not words, because a lot of people think, well, if I tell them this is my boundary and then they don't respect it, then what do I do? And my response is, well, boundaries aren't words. Boundaries are behavior. So if you tell your daughter that hitting you is not okay, if you tell your spouse that it's not okay that he demeans you every time you express your emotions to him, that's not a boundary, but you are communicating something. The boundary is the behavior. And so what gets complicated in toxic relationships is that you have to understand that your boundary is your behavior, so you have to do something, meaning you need to remove yourself. There needs to be something that you do to not allow that person to do something. And then the other sometimes painful thing is you have to recognize that when you set a boundary with someone who's toxic, they will get worse. But if we look at a relationship as a system, right? So systems always strive for equilibrium. So if you guys are here and this is how you always kind of interact, and he's breaking your boundaries, you're not really doing much about it, you're getting resentful, if you come here, his drive is going to be to pull you back there. And I don't want to just say his, because it could be his or her. Their drive is going to be to pull you back here, which means they have to get bigger and badder and more upset in order to do that. If you maintain here, a couple of things will happen. Number one, it's going to get worse. Number two, the behavior itself might become extinct because they won't be getting what they need anymore from it. So it may look like they're kind of coming up here. And to some extent they are, unfortunately. But what that means is that if you hold your ground, it will get better. But unfortunately, when it comes to toxic people, they can appear to appease you in one area, but then it just kind of changes and morphs. So you're going to be dealing with that probably in a different area.
Interesting. Yeah. I love how you've broken that down and really, really getting into detail about that dynamic of setting the boundaries and being realistic about what generally happens with male or female or what have you, when that boundary is set, that it tends to get worse, or at least for a period of time, or like you said, going into another area, which I think is important for people to get, because it's kind of like having an expectation of what might happen, right?
Right. And that's the thing that makes people feel like they don't work, because they set the boundary, they're very proud of themselves, and then the behavior gets worse. And so it's like, oh, it's not working. No, it's just, that's the process. That's the process.
And this might be a misconception we just talked about, but what are some of the biggest misconceptions you see with people concerning boundaries?
Well, I think, we talked about some of them, but I think the biggest thing, which is probably just an internal feeling, is that I'm setting these boundaries to fix the relationship, or I'm setting these boundaries to change their behavior. Because often the problems that we have in toxic relationships, we feel, is the behavior of someone else's. And unfortunately, that's not why you're setting a boundary. You're setting a boundary to protect yourself. And if you can kind of shift that lens and recognize that the boundary is self-care and you're setting it to take care of and protect yourself, and it may not result in a change in the other person's behavior, I think you're in a healthier place.
Gotcha. Yeah. And you also touched on, right, what are sometimes the outcomes of setting a boundary or strengthening a boundary? Anything else you can share about that? Like what happens in a relationship when you begin to strengthen a boundary?
Well, after the initial kind of rebound period, sometimes, depending on how toxic the relationship is, there can be an increased respect in the partners, from the partner. It just depends on the level of toxicity in the relationship. But I think most important, and I always talk about when we're working in relationships, you need to work on yourself, not the other person. The most important thing that happens over time is that you develop a level of confidence. And as you develop confidence, you will accept less in the relationship. And the relationship has to change. It will either change for the better. He will begin to respect you more, or you'll get to a point where you find ways to extricate yourself from the relationship, whether, if we're talking about in-laws or children or business relationships, you'll find ways to distance yourself because now you've become healthier. Or sometimes with a partner, you may get to a point where you are healthy enough to leave a relationship that is very dysfunctional and unhealthy for you.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk more about that for people who are watching right now who are in, let's say, a toxic romantic partnership and they just feel like they just can't quite get out, right? They're not quite ready yet, or they don't feel healthy enough yet, like you just said. Any suggestions for them on being in that space?
I think the biggest thing I'd like to do is just encourage them, because I work with so many women in this space, and not only do they feel shame about the relationship that they're in, they feel stuck. And they are very, their self-talk is just completely in the dumps, and they're feeling bad, not just about the relationship, but about the fact that they can't get out of it. And what we do know is that it takes women 7 attempts on the average to get out of a toxic or sometimes abusive relationship. That's normal. And the reason is because there's so much going on in this relationship. Some of it's good, and it's easy to hold on to the good. And that good that is there often keeps us in a space of feeling like we can fix it, feeling like we can try again, feeling like maybe we can change something. And sometimes feeling like, well, if I set boundaries, I'll fix this relationship. All the things, people are looking for tools sometimes to stay in a relationship because it's too scary and unhealthy. It's too scary to get out, I should say. So my encouragement is you're on a journey and it's okay. And you can give yourself the time. And the more you learn, the stronger you get. Eventually you can get to that place. That's my encouragement, because so many women just feel very stuck in that place. I get that.
Yeah, and that leads me to another question, right? When I was looking over your bio, it talks about how you help women redefine their strength. And that kind of ties into what we're talking about right now, right? As far as like having that courage or confidence to potentially exit a relationship. Can you talk about what it means to redefine strength?
Yeah, so many women that I work with are in a space of they've been beaten down to a certain extent by the toxicity in their relationship. And when I start seeing them, often it's, I don't really want to get out of this marriage, or I don't believe in divorce. So I just want you to help me feel better in this space. And I actually don't think that's a bad place to start, because often they have lost so much of themselves and they have lost so much of what they might have considered strength prior. And another caveat is high-powered, very successful women often get themselves in situations with very toxic relationships. And that just, that feels so, inauthentic to them, and they're struggling with that as well. I don't remember what your question was.
We were talking about redefining strength.
Yeah. And so I help them, number one, normalize the fact that you can be a very strong, competent woman outside of your marriage and still have a lot of weakness inside of your marriage, that those two things can still exist. And it doesn't mean that you as a person are weak. It just means that you have, sometimes, I'm trying to remember the name of the author who wrote the book, Becoming Toxic Person Proof. She talks about smart girl syndrome.
Yes, I know who you're talking about. I can't think of her name either, but yes, I think she's actually been on an Avaya event, but I'm not thinking of it right now. Yeah.
Yeah. I hate that I can't think of her name because I want to give her credit for this, but she talks about smart girl syndrome, and smart girl syndrome, smart boy syndrome, is something that happens to people who are very hard workers, who are used to working hard and having delayed gratification and putting all of this work into things in their life, and they actually reap a lot of benefits. They're very successful. And so they apply that to a relationship that unfortunately is unhealthy. And they keep thinking, if I work harder, if I try harder, if I, delay my gratification, that I'm going to be able to make this work. And so it's not that there's something wrong with you and that you are weak. It's that you need to understand that your strength is there. You just need to apply it in this relationship. So I help women remember that they are strong, and I help women find their strength, and I help women start to put in their boundaries so that they can develop confidence and begin to stand up for themselves in their relationships.
Yes, great example. And I love that because often, these tendencies show up in different areas, but some other areas where, we're doing great. We're not having really, many challenges, or we're just,
Right.
kicking butt in this area of life. And another area we can really get challenged by. So very normal, right? Most of us have similar challenges in that way. And for people who are, let's say they have gotten out of an unhealthy relationship, any thoughts or suggestions on how to stop repeating the cycle if they've had several toxic relationships?
Yes. I think it goes back to boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. But I think you also need to understand what attracted you to that relationship to begin with. I think it's super important to be in therapy after you've come out of a toxic relationship, because without a lot of processing, without a lot of real intention, you will tend to find someone who looks very different from the other person, who in many ways is just the same. And a lot of people trick themselves into thinking, I'm done with that. Now I'm going to know. And unless you've really done a lot of work and understanding your history, the messages that you got from your childhood, understanding your self-talk, understanding maybe your need to people please, understanding your need to be wanted, desired, and how that affects your drive to please or enable, understanding codependency and what part that might have had in your life, or if it was smart girl syndrome. It's really doing your work. And if you do your work, then you absolutely can get into a relationship that is healthy and an equal partnership and everything that you deserve.
Yeah, you've mentioned codependency a couple times, and that often comes up in conversations of toxic relationships. What is your definition of codependency, out of curiosity?
Yeah, a lot of people are shying away from that idea and actually demonizing it as if, talking, people call it victim blaming sometimes when it comes to codependency. I don't necessarily agree. So codependency is a dynamic that occurs. And an interesting thing is sometimes the person who is both of people who are codependent can be controlling, and that they want to control the situation, right? They want to control and manipulate each other for love, usually. So someone who is codependent will often enable someone else to do something that is unhealthy because they're trying to get something good. It comes from good intentions, right? Now, some people have said, well, if your husband is an addict, it's not fair to label you codependent because maybe you're not codependent. Maybe you're just a victim, right? Unfortunately, I think many people who don't have a history of codependency can go into a relationship and over time, over years, over decades, can develop codependent behavior, because it's very hard to stay in a relationship with someone who is unhealthy, with someone who is an addict, with someone who is abusive, without enabling it in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you diving into that. And we do events on codependency. So I have personally no issue with the term, but I definitely know that a lot of people, are shying away from it. But just to understand, right, the different like set of behaviors or tendencies that come with a label, so to speak, of codependency. I think it's important for us to understand that, and how it can affect us in relationships, whether we went into it as codependent or didn't, right? So I love that. Also, you talked about control and manipulation in there on both sides, and I think that's an important thing to remember.
Mhm.
I definitely, being a more codependent personality myself, I see all of my ways that I like to control and manipulate, and yes, and it's usually for like to feel safe or to feel secure or to have a sure thing and know that everything's going to be okay and all that. Can you talk a little bit about that for people? I guess really both sides, like how to heal from manipulation, control, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I can talk more on the side of being manipulated, meaning when we talk about codependency, we can look at it as, okay, there's the person who has a toxic behavior, and then there's the enabler, right? But it could be either side. Like you said, both are codependent and both are trying to control. Often people think, oh, the enabler isn't trying to control. And like you said, yes, they absolutely are trying to control. And I think it's really important for someone who tends to enable to be able to take ownership of that, and to be able to look at, what is it that I'm trying to control here? What is it that I'm fearful of? What is it that I'm trying to avoid? What is it that I'm trying to get him to do or not do? Or what is it that am I scared of abandonment? Am I scared of rejection? Am I scared of failure? I think I've lost the question.
It was kind
Again,
of a broad
I tend to start
question.
talking and then I lose the question.
It's all good. We were talking about like healing from being manipulated.
Yeah. So part of the healing process is being able to name it, to name what it is that they're doing, and being able to recognize what your response is and why it's there. And then it goes back to your self-talk, because, I had a client that I was working with last night, and she's in a very toxic relationship, and she has this self-talk, which is that if I do anything for myself, then it's selfish, which means then that she swung the pendulum, and she only believes that she's not selfish, she is fully self-sacrificing. And she is very much an enabler, and it looks like she's a victim, but she's really trying to control the narrative of who she is, and she's trying to control the people around her to make sure that she feels loved by giving them these things. But what happens is it doesn't work, and so she's left feeling like empty, and she's left feeling used.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thank you. That's a good example of and we can all get in that space of like thinking it's one way or the other, like you mentioned, right? It's not right. We can all be victimized, right, in life, but then like staying in the victim mentality doesn't really get us anywhere, right? Then we're not, coming up out of it. So I think that's a great way of looking at that dynamic. And it does kind of twist in and on around each other, with two different people controlling or manipulating in different ways. It's yeah. So I appreciate that. And that also leads me to like working on our relationship with ourselves, because I know that's a big focus of yours. Why is that so important?
Well, it's important because you're all you've got. And when I talk about self-talk, I talk about the reality that we talk to ourselves all day, every day. We talk to ourselves more than anybody talks to us, and we talk to ourselves more than we talk to anybody else. And so that makes us our greatest influencer. And our self-talk drives all of our relationships. And I'm talking about self-talk because our self-talk reflects our relationship with ourselves. And so anything that's going on in your world, it comes through you, right? Anything that you engage with, it comes through you. It comes through your lens. It comes through everything that you tell yourself and how you see yourself in the world. And so if your relationship with yourself is skewed, unhealthy, dysfunctional, so will everything else essentially in your life be. So that's why your relationship with yourself is so important.
Got it. And for people who have a hard time, like, right, if they're self-sacrificing and they really always like to focus on that other person or other people, any like baby steps they could take to help, right, strengthen their relationship with themselves?
Sometimes I just try to get them to understand that when it comes to enabling, we think that we're helping the people in our lives. We think that we're loving them by enabling them to do whatever the things are that they're doing, whether it's just being toxic or addiction or something like that. But we're actually hurting them. We're disabling them, and in hurting them, we hurt ourselves. So it does always come back to ourselves. But if we can recognize that when we set boundaries, when we stand up to things that are not okay, we are not just doing it for us. We can also be doing it for them. So that's not even self-serving, right? If you recognize that, when you make your child do the thing that they don't want to do, but you know is good for them, you're helping them. You're not being a mean mom, or you're not being selfish, or you're not being uncaring. And when you can switch that lens a little bit and recognize that the things that you do to create boundaries for yourself, to care for you, you're modeling that to your children, you're modeling that to your spouse, you're serving other people in the process. So for someone who's really, really, an empath and really stuck to being self-sacrificing, that's a way to help them kind of change that lens.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it, since the tendency is to look at others and help others. So right, shifting it from like, okay, well, what I'm doing is actually not helping. So if I do it this way, then I'm helping them and me. So that's great. I love that. That's a great piece of advice. Let's talk about how people can learn more about you as we're running low on time. I know you have a great free gift for everyone, and there's a button below. Can you share about that?
I do. Yeah, it's a self-talk course. I think it's called Mindset Shift. I did it a few years ago, and it's been really helpful for a lot of my clients. It's really just a small course on understanding your self-talk, understanding where it came from, how it originated, how it affects your life, and how to change it so that you are experiencing a better relationship for yourself. So you can click that link and get the course for free.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, and my hangout place is Instagram, also Dr. Zoe Shaw, and you can connect with me on my podcast or blog through all of those.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing with us today. And any last insights, anything else that you want to put out there before we wrap up?
I just think the same encouragement that it's a process, and it's okay if your process is slower than you want it to be. If you just keep taking the steps, you will get there.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, thank you for doing this with us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you, Avaya students who are watching or listening right now, for showing up for yourself today on your own journey. And we'll see you again very soon. Take care. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this last class with Dr. Zoe Shaw. She talked with us today about setting healthy boundaries. We talked about many things as it relates to boundaries, and just recognizing how important it is to obviously have boundaries, how important it is to obviously communicate them to ourselves and others, but also to follow through with whatever behaviors or consequences we set as those boundaries. So if you talk to me like this in the future, I'm going to leave the room, right? And actually following through in your behavior is the consequence of whatever, if that boundary has been breached. So just remembering how important that is. And I hope that you found this helpful in your journey. Obviously, boundaries are so crucial to not only understanding who we are, right? Having boundaries within our own self and recognizing what we like and what we don't like, and what we want and what we don't want, and all of those kinds of things. And then being really solid in our own personal boundaries and having a solid relationship with ourselves then is going to reflect out into other relationships, so they can be healthier as well. So I hope that you found this helpful, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.
Avaya has changed my life.
Avaya has made me the woman I am today.
Avaya is my home.
Avaya is personal freedom.
Avaya is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about Avaya.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, Avaya, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at Avaya is what the world needs.